offshore investments, prostitution, tax havens, drug trafficking, wealth management, the looting of natural resources. Everything seems to oppose banks and organized crime. Everything except for one detail. In their never-ending quest to conquer new markets, mobsters force their way into the corridors of power with one imperative: to hide their money. In 1 century, white-collar organized crime has left its mark on the worlds of business and international finance. Our 3 films will tell the story of a criminal alliance between mafias and banks.
I've been thinking about this for the last 3 days. I've reached the point where somebody has to know the truth about me. I want somebody to know my life. The condition is only this: I'll give it all to you. I won't hold back nothing. But you gotta promise you won't use it, no part of it, for 10 years. And I mean 10 years after I die.
In 1960, Charles Lucky Luciano, the exiled godfather of the New York Mafia, confided in a Hollywood producer and writer. He told him in blunt language about his life in organized crime and revealed details about the forming of the American branch of Cosa Nostra. For Lucky Luciano, serious business started in the early 20s in Manhattan during Prohibition.
We controlled plants, warehouses, we had exporters and importers. Naturally, we didn't pay no business taxes, like General Motors. But that didn't mean our expenses wasn't pretty heavy. We greased the police and the politicians. It was all part of the overheads, just like any business.
New York was crucial in 2 ways to the story of Prohibition. The first was simply its geography. New York was a central entry point for all of the illegal alcohol coming into the country. It was the beginning of the train lines. It was a major port. But secondly, it was the key place where financial capital and political influence came together in America.
In the 1920s, Wall Street was becoming a hub of international finance. The dollar was yet to conquer the world, but the bankers of Manhattan were the forerunners of new capitalism, drunk on its own success. A few blocks from Wall Street, on the Lower East Side, the contrast was stark. Irish, Jewish, Chinese, and Italian immigrants lived in poverty. Gangs ran the streets, along with protection rackets and prostitution. The prohibition of alcohol would change the world of crime.
In terms of the structure of American cities, every major intersection in every major city in the United States had 4 corners. And on 4 corners, there were 4 saloons. They were the public spaces of American society. And overnight, they disappeared.
Prohibition, campaigned for by white puritanical America, tipped what was then the country's 7th largest industry right into the hands of the mob.
Drinkers were a bunch of sheep just waiting to be fleeced. A case of scotch right off the boat cost us around 25 bucks. Sold by the glass, it would bring us as high as $1,000.
The markup on a case of Scotch whiskey imported illegally into the country was about the same as the markup on cocaine today. So that gives you a sense of just how profitable importing and distributing alcohol could be. This required organized crime to develop distribution networks, to develop all of the elements of a supply chain, and that meant cooperation.
Quand on parle de la prohibition,
During Prohibition, millions of cases of liquor were delivered every week across the vast territory of the states.
donc ça nécessite
That required industrialized processing and production,
de la production, de la comptabilité,
along with accounting and banking, etc., because mafiosi were generally very careful with their costs and profits.
coûts, etc.
So they needed people to take care of that.
Young Lucky Luciano, the rising star of the mob, realized that for the Mafia to seize control, they would have to learn all about the workings of finance. Luciano went into business with his childhood buddy, also from a poor district of Manhattan, Meyer Lansky. Lansky fascinated Luciano with his unparalleled gift for mental arithmetic, which meant nothing written down, so no traces.
Meyer was always reading books about business, economics, things like that. One day he shows me a library book, and he's all excited about it. Charlie, this writer talks about a thing called the law of supply and demand. If you got a lot of what people want and can't get, then you can supply the demand and shovel in the dough. That simple economic precept was quickly dubbed Lansky's Law.
What's remarkable about the partnership between Luciano and Lansky is just how strategic they were. Luciano said of Lansky that he could see around corners. He could anticipate what was coming and make the moves necessary to exploit the resulting opportunity.
One of Meyer Lansky's first ideas was to install slot machines in the speakeasies for wealthy white Americans, while setting up an underground lottery for the poor and blacks who dreamed of winning the jackpot.
500, wait. 500. 309. 309. 788. 788. 591. 591. 25 cents each.
So much money was coming in from the lotteries that we had to have meetings all the time to figure out what to do with the dough. That's when I really started to respect the bankers and to be jealous of them. They could take their depositors' money and invest it so they could pay interest and still have a healthy profit.
In the Roaring '20s, money and booze had the United States heady, with pay rises, mass consumerism, and seemingly endless growth. Whether you were a cab driver, a sales clerk, or a boss, everyone played the stock market, and banks readily handed out loans to keep the machine running.
The 1920s was a period of financial speculation. All means were acceptable if you wanted to make money. One common characteristic of periods of financial euphoria is that swindlers are always present in greater numbers. And the 1920s were rife with financial scams. It's the historical sign of a financial boom.
In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. In one morning, entire fortunes were lost. Fear swept America. The country demanded explanations from bankers, brokers, and businessmen.
The public became aware that people who seemed respectable on the outside, wealthy bankers and financiers, they could also be guilty of actions that endangered the capitalist system itself. People started to become aware that white-collar criminals did actually exist, and they came up with all kinds of nicknames for them, like banksters, a play on the word gangsters, and these banksters had endangered America's entire financial system.
But the Italian-American mafia was far from a financial crisis. At the height of Prohibition, the mob's main problem was what to do with all their cash. Yet to find a foothold in banking, they did start to finance the struggling economy. Numerous enterprises on the verge of ruin, manufacturers, meat packers, dairy produce companies, trucking companies, and other key sectors of the economy found themselves under mafia control.
The cash flowed and was largely reinvested in the prohibition system. But it would also be used to finance what we call conspicuous consumption, a lifestyle in which gangsters like to show off their wealth. Some even claim that the term money laundering came from Al Capone, who owned a chain of laundries, having invested his dirty money in a totally legal business area.
In 1931, out of the blue, it wasn't a banker who found himself on trial for financial wrongdoing, but Chicago's king of prohibition himself, Al Capone. After years of unsuccessful attempts, the prosecutors realized that to nail Capone, they would have to try him for his lifestyle rather than his crimes. The mobster was living a life of luxury without being able to provide a legitimate source for his income. Al Capone went down for tax evasion.
It became clear after that if you were in criminal business, you damn well better come up with a way to hide the money so the police couldn't get their hands on it, and so that the Internal Revenue Service wouldn't know that you had hidden money, and that was something that was going to get you in jail.
In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the White House. His priority? To drag the country out of the Great Depression. He launched the New Deal to aid the victims of the financial crisis. He also oversaw a banking revolution in the form of the Glass-Steagall Act.
The new banking law was a genius invention in terms of public regulation. It started by saying, we must separate retail banks and merchant banks. A retail bank is where you and I have our accounts. Then there are the merchant banks, which speculate on the national and international financial markets. Roosevelt said, we'll separate them. There'll be banks that finance the economy and banks that play on the markets. That way, if there was a panic on the markets and the merchant banks messed up, at least retail banking, which finances our economy, would still be there. So the banks were split up and regulated. Anyway, banks were very profitable, so they accepted the financial regulation laid out in Roosevelt's new banking law, and that resulted in 40 years of banking and financial stability.
Roosevelt's policy marked the beginning of the welfare state and the redistribution of wealth. But the U.S. Treasury soon discovered that a large part of the money of the great fortunes subjected to taxation had vanished. Another world had been built in secret.
The report requested by Henry Morgenthau, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, is interesting because it testifies to the use of tax havens to evade taxes. It was a very opaque construction industry that built the screens between the income I earn and the income I declare, which is subject to taxation. And that was organized on an industrial scale in the 1920s and 30s to allow the rich to deposit money elsewhere and hide it from those whose job it was to tax it.
In the early 20th century, tax havens sprang up around the United States and Canada, but also in Panama. These safe, discreet financial hubs facilitated the movement of money from large fortunes, but also attracted dirty money. Across the Atlantic, in Europe, one country already had a long history of financial opacity: Switzerland. A haven for the assets of aristocrats during the French Revolution of 1789, and then that of the great industrial families of the 19th century, Switzerland wrote banking secrecy into its law in 1934.
The Swiss banking law of 1934, the famous Article 47, basically states any bank personnel who give information on the accounts of clients to the Swiss or a foreign government will be subject to criminal proceedings. It became a felony, which meant that for years and years, no Swiss journalist could investigate bank accounts. Because if you were in Switzerland and you revealed the slightest piece of banking information, you could end up in jail.
So, yes, Switzerland is a place essential for anybody who wants to keep anything secret. Governments, criminals, business people, rich families. Switzerland is the place.
It would be a few years before mobsters realized the interest in placing their money at the heart of the international banking system. For the time being, the New York Mafia had other concerns. In 1933, prohibition was abolished. Suddenly deprived of its primary source of income, the Mafia reorganized. Lucky Luciano had the old guard assassinated, became the boss of the New York Mafia, and proposed a managerial pact between the major families in the east of the United States. This was the birth of the Commission, the ancestor of the American Cosa Nostra. The Commission was Luciano's contribution to the history of organized crime. But the gangster hit the headlines for a very different reason. In 1936, Luciano was convicted of forced prostitution and was sentenced to 40 years in jail. End of a chapter. Meanwhile, across the globe, an orphan raised in poverty was revolutionizing the criminal world by combining mob business, political infiltration, and, something completely new, banking entrepreneurship. This man was Du Yusheng, and his criminal career coincided with the historic upheavals of the Pearl of the East, Shanghai. In the 1920s, Shanghai was the temple of colonial capitalism, where human life was worthless. The main port of China, and soon all of Asia, Shanghai was plagued by two vices, opium and money. In his unforgettable account of China, the journalist Albert Londres wrote,
"In Shanghai, all alphabets are unknown. Here, language isn't written with letters, but with numbers. To become a millionaire, you don't need to know how to read and write. Counting is enough. Shanghai is a very fat golden calf."
On Shanghai's major thoroughfare, the Bund, banks stood one next to the other. The most famous on the waterfront was the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, founded by the British in the 19th century during the Opium Wars. Amid the financial hustle and bustle, Chinese gangsters, organized into triads, controlled the underworld economy. One of the most famous venues in Shanghai, Le Grand Monde, was the precursor of what the American Mafia would later make Las Vegas. A vast building contained everything: a concert hall, a restaurant, upper floors with a casino, a night bar. And right at the top, a hotel with prostitution, heroin, and opium. Enter Du Yusheng. Age 20, he joined the powerful triad, the Green Gang, based in the heart of the French Concession. In fewer than 5 years, the illiterate Du Yusheng became the boss of the Green Gang and reigned over thousands of henchmen, informers, prostitutes, and debt collectors, and would take full advantage of political upheavals in China. In the mid-1920s, the Chinese Communist Party, founded inside the French concession, is a source of worry. The colonial police asked the Green Gang to quash any kind of political uprising. In return, the gang's opium dens were tolerated. A pact was sealed between the French authorities and Du Yusheng. In April 1927, as strikes were breaking out, Du Yusheng had strikers murdered by Green Gang henchmen. In return for his commitment, the French appointed Du Yusheng to the municipal council. In 1931, Du Yusheng inaugurated the Temple of Ancestors in his home village. The temple would soon house China's largest morphine refinery. The exclusive distributor of opium for all China, Du Yusheng was also president of the Board of Opium Suppression. A genius of duplicity and head of one of China's largest triads, Du Yusheng consolidated his position at the crossroads between crime and banking by greasing the palms of the entire political class. He was appointed director of the Shanghai Stock Exchange and director of the Bank of China. The mobster certainly enjoyed his wealth. A fan of Chinese opera, he became a patron. He then opened his own movie studios. But off the set, a different story was being told. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 brought war. In Shanghai in 1937, the foreign concessions were badly hit by Japanese bombing raids. To protect his interests, Du Yusheng decided to leave China and move to British-governed Hong Kong.
Dear Shu, I'm writing to you having arrived in Hong Kong. Since the crisis, the price of gold has risen as fast as a fleeing horse. Since the government announced certain measures, the situation seems to have calmed down. But our government is killing the hen to take its eggs. The future is unpredictable. Please keep my businesses running in Shanghai. My health is improving, and I plan to return early next month. Brother Du.
After the war, the foreign concessions were returned to China. And then, in 1949, the communists came to power in Beijing, marking the end of a world. The triad bosses packed up and left for Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. When Du Yusheng died in 1951 in Hong Kong from the long-term effects of opium use, Shanghai had already entered into a state of deep lethargy from which it wouldn't emerge until 40 years later. The victors of World War II, led by the United States, set out to build a new framework for international security to guarantee peace and reconstruction. One particular event would reshape international finance: the Bretton Woods Conference.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
Bretton Woods, c'est le prolongement.
Bretton Woods was the international extension of what Roosevelt had initiated on a national level. The establishing of an economy based on finance that was state-regulated and coordinated by all the member states. Central banks would intervene to ensure that currencies didn't overfluctuate, so that the international monetary system would remain stable, and capital couldn't easily pass from one country to another.
At Bretton Woods, the dollar was imposed as the world reference currency, the only one convertible into gold by the United States Federal Reserve. A seemingly impregnable wall had been constructed to impede the world's abusers of secret finance. But criminal operators would soon start looking for possible breaches in this wall.
Without knowing it, governments largely contribute to the accumulation of criminal fortunes through laws supposedly enacted to protect their economies and their citizens. Most of the so-called respectable families, like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, can attribute the origin of their fortunes to illegal profits and tax evasion. But governments are not inclined to strike at the heart of the system. They're not as good at finding dirty money as they are at helping to create it. Capitalism is the udder of the plentiful cow from which flows milk for everyone.
That was a quote by an Italian tax lawyer and banker. Michele Sindona was one of the wealthiest financiers in the world. The banker of the Mafia and the Vatican, and a great admirer of Machiavelli, Sindona dedicated his life to money and a hatred of communism. He was an emblematic figure of the Cold War era.
Sindona was a guy who was incredibly slick. One of these people who would charm you to the point where you'd give them everything in your wallet and you would still be trying to figure out how to get more to give him. This was a man who had that incredible charisma that enables him to convince serious people he's a serious person. So it's not surprising that this is a man who could jump into all sorts of situations. And although on paper there's not much to him, he had the capacity to just suck people in like crazy.
Michele Sindona's working life began in Sicily towards the end of World War II. The story is well known. After the liberation of Sicily, the Allies entrusted important positions to mafia families who had been crushed by 2 decades of fascism. The aim? To halt communist influence and ensure the distribution of food. From a poor Sicilian family, young Michele Sindona bought a truck and began transporting contraband goods.
You couldn't do that type of business in Sicily in the 1940s without the authorization of the Mafia. So back then, he was already linked to the local Mafia and already caught between the two worlds.
At the same time, dozens of Italian-American mafiosi arrived in Sicily, forced into exile. Among them, Lucky Luciano, who had agreed to leave American soil in exchange for his freedom. A sad return to his origins.
In 1946, everyone had a finger in the black market. It was just a question of survival. In less than 6 months, I almost doubled my bankroll. I actually became a fucking banker like the guys on Wall Street. But I was just waiting for Lansky to give me a signal, nothing more.
While the fallen godfather played Wall Street banker in his home village, Michele Sindona was busy seeking out new avenues for organized crime. In the early 50s, having graduated from law school, he moved to Milan, the economic capital of a country in the throes of Reconstruction, and began a brilliant career as a lawyer.
Post-war Milan had become a huge industrial city. It was the bridgehead of Italian industrialization. Milan was also a very open city. Workers came from the south to work in the plants, followed by lots of professionals, also from the south, who wanted to make a career in Milan. Accountants, attorneys, solicitors, and that was how Sindona arrived in the city.
In Milan, he opened up a small tax law firm. Then, little by little, he became the reference for rich Milanese who didn't want to pay too much tax. How come Sindona was the best at this little game? Thanks to an intuition which seems commonplace to us now, but which at the time was a genuine innovation in Italy. The use of foreign banks, secret accounts, Swiss banks, money earned in Italy transferred to Switzerland, then placed in impenetrable financial systems with fallout points in Liechtenstein. In short, anywhere that the Italian tax authorities weren't allowed to investigate.
Almost all companies in Italy maintained at least 5 sets of balance books. One for the taxmen, one for the banks, one for the minority shareholders, one for the board of directors, and one that contained the truth.
Age 30, Sindona founded Fasco AG in Liechtenstein. This holding company was his black box, the legal entity that enabled the Italian tax lawyer to carry out his financial operations far from prying eyes. Sindona reveled in financial innovation and became an expert at it. He invented the back-to-back loan, a loan taken out with a bank in Switzerland or Liechtenstein and secretly guaranteed by dirty money, a perfect circuit breaker.
The identities of account owners are hidden from the eyes of bank employees, not from top management. This is why smart depositors devise further screens. They operate through bearer shares companies set up for them by lawyers or accountants who have, yet another screen, received their instructions from phantom fiduciary companies, which are protected by secrecy laws more rigorous than those that apply to banks.
In the early years of the Cold War, Italy was the geopolitical fault line between the two blocs, Western and Soviet, the theater of a fierce political battle, made even fiercer when the Italian Communist Party, aligned with Moscow, seemed on the verge of taking power. Armed with his visceral anti-communism, Michele Sindona worked his way into Freemasonry, where he rubbed shoulders with every circle of secret power in Italy.
Freemasonry is like a trade fair, where bankers, secret service chiefs, politicians, and businessmen swap information. But there is also members of organized crime. At the time, mainly Cosa Nostra.
It was pretty much a case of mutual attraction among those with power, and the mafia is an element of power. But it was the same thing in the provinces. On the main squares of villages, every Sunday morning, you'd see the mayor, the member of parliament, the pharmacist, the police chief, and the local mafia boss all together.
In the early 50s, Michele Sindona already felt that Italy was too small for him. To fill his address book with even more names, he made a trip to New York.
What Sindona did in the early 1950s in the United States was build up a network of right-wing politicians, and then a network with bankers. He realized that if you wanted to be a big international financier, which is just what he wanted to be, you had to get close to the dollar.
During his stay in New York, Sindona had another meeting to attend. On the eve of a massive upheaval in the region, he met with members of the Gambino family, one of the branches of the American Cosa Nostra. The East Coast Mafia was preparing a vast network of heroin trafficking with, as the hub, a paradise island in the Caribbean Sea. Cuba. In 1952, the man in power in Havana was the dictator Fulgencio Batista. With his brutal regime and ruthless secret police, in Cuba, arbitrary decisions and corruption ruled. Batista had a history. During Prohibition, Cuba was a hub of alcohol smuggling into Florida. Fulgencio Batista had forged a friendship with a man we've already come across, Meyer Lansky himself. Once in power, Batista offered Lansky a post as a governmental advisor for the development of the island. In Cuba, the Mafia established the same system it had put into place in New York in the 1930s, only this time on the scale of a country.
Lansky became the chief architect of an effort to use the instruments of the state to develop a new political economy in Cuba based around tourism, gambling, nightlife, the development of drug trafficking, prostitution, and all of the adjacent vice markets that go with that.
Havana was something unique in the history of organized crime. I mean, they had a state. Honest gambling, I mean, good tables, beautiful environment, glorious hotels, wide open bordellos. They had built an empire. They had built, an adult Disneyland, a fantasy world for consenting adults.
Lansky was at the center of this, and he was personally significantly invested in the country. And the centerpiece of this whole approach was a new development bank set up by Cuba called Bandes, the National Bank for Development, which was used for debt financing of infrastructure projects, roads, airports, hotels, casinos, all of the infrastructure needed for this tourism economy.
The Bandes tied Mafia interests to the economic and social development of Cuba. 28 new hotels were constructed in 5 years. 5 casinos were opened by the Mafia: the Capri, the Hilton, the Deauville, the Comodoro, and the Riviera. The Riviera belonged to Meyer Lansky. It cost $14 million, $6 million of which were paid by the Cuban taxpayers themselves.
They were so invested emotionally, financially, strategically in this model that the mob became blind to the weakness of the foundations of the model, in particular, the social foundations of the model.
In the late 1950s, a growing number of the population, excluded from the share of wealth, began supporting the young guerreros fighting up in the mountains. Fidel Castro, Ernesto Guevara, and their brothers and sisters in arms advanced day by day on the capital. New York's Mafia families, at the head of a massive heroin trafficking network between Cuba, Europe, and the United States, started to consider a change of alliances. In October 1957, at the Grand Hotel des Palmes in Palermo, Sicilian and American Mafia bosses gathered for a summit, which would become a turning point in the existence of the mob. The main topics of discussion were the reorganization of heroin transport routes and the establishment of Palermo as a new trafficking hub.
The American Cosa Nostra suggested that the Sicilian Mafia follow its example in 2 things. The first was creating jurisdictions, dividing up territory according to competencies and attributions of power. The second was getting into the drug business.
During the meeting, the Mafia decided they needed a financier to manage the earnings from the growing trade in heroin. And there was one man who knew the workings of hidden finance, dummy corporations, and other money-disguising tools. Michele Sindona became the banker of Cosa Nostra.
In 1957, he took over the management of Mafia money, Not laundering. There were already people in place who could do that, making illegal money look legal. This money needed to be invested so it would earn. So in '57, Sindona was asked to manage money for the Mafia.
The Mafia saw Sindona as the key to the international banking system. And he knew that in working for the Mafia, he would have his hands on colossal sums of money. Sindona was now in the middle of a nebula in which the great Milanese fortunes and Mafia cash circulated, soon to be joined by Vatican money. In the early 60s, Sindona became close friends with the Archbishop of Milan, Cardinal Montini. In 1963, Montini was elected Pope under the name Paul VI. Sindona obtained access to the holiest of holies, the IOR, the Vatican Bank, and was placed in charge of the finances of the patrimony of the Holy See.
La Banca del Vaticano è una banca offshore.
The Vatican Bank is an offshore located in the middle of Rome.
Sindona riesce a restaurare.
Thanks to the relationship Sindona managed to forge with the Vatican, he was able to use IOR as another toolbox for operating across the world
in giro per il mondo.
And attracting and multiplying big money.
Attirare molti soldi.
In 1964, Sindona went into business with a banker just back from London with some sensational news. The Eurodollar. Since the end of the war, the City of London had yet to return to its former glory. The pound sterling had lost value against the dollar, and regulation was so strict that bankers could no longer play with the fortunes that came into their hands. After the Bretton Woods agreements, the British banker was bored.
The life of the typical London banker was to come into work at about 10:30, 11 in the morning, check some papers on his desk, and then prepare to meet the lunch guests. And then you would go to the private dining room, have a long lunch with multiple wines, and everybody was home, probably napping by about 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. And it was a pretty leisurely and somewhat boring life, but not totally.
But boredom didn't stop them from conspiring. A handful of city bankers would set about chipping away at the fine architecture of Bretton Woods by creating the Eurodollar market. Foreign investors were hence authorized to deposit and borrow US dollars from British banks. A new banking space created a financial no man's land. Operators were able to shift money with zero scrutiny or control. American regulators couldn't do a thing because the dollars were outside of their jurisdiction. Same for the Bank of England, since transactions were carried out in dollars, a currency from outside of Britain.
The Eurodollar market was a highly secretive market, which allowed people to hide their identity, to hide the source of the monies, to hide the way in which the money has been transferred from one jurisdiction to another, and to hide the way in which the money is used. So you've created, essentially, a criminogenic environment in which it is possible for criminals to merge their funds with perfectly clean money. And inevitably that is what happened, because it was the criminals of this world who were amongst the first users of the offshore Eurodollar market.
The staggering boom in deposits of Eurodollars marked the return of the British Empire. Only this empire wasn't colonial, but financial. And its heart was no longer Buckingham Palace, but the City of London. It was in the former dependencies of the Crown, like the Channel Islands and the West Indies, that this new empire would spread out, until it had control of half the world's offshore banking.
Les banques américaines
American banks moved into the city of London in large numbers during the second half of the 1960s, saying to their clients, look, if you want to earn big interests, we go to London. After that, Société Générale, Dutch bankers, Belgian banks, everyone moved to London. This was an example of bankers implementing an organized strategy, fully aware that they were breaking their own country's banking and financial regulations.
And so it was that Michele Sindona suggested to the Pope that he discreetly invest the Vatican's money in eurodollars via dummy corporations. The Pontiff gave him his blessing and bestowed on him the title Mercator Senesis Romanum Curiam Secens. In other words, banker of the Vatican. The servant of the underworld became the financier of God. From one tax haven to the next. In the mid-1960s, the British financial empire launched a new flagship, the Bahamas. The haunt of pirates in the 18th century and an offshore investment center during Prohibition, the Bahamas had a long history with illegality. And it's here that we rediscover the unsinkable financier of the American Mafia, Meyer Lansky. The mobster had been forced to move to the Bahamas. After the Cuban Revolution and the closure of his casinos, Lansky lost every last dime. And on top of that, he had also lost his old buddy and partner, Lucky Luciano, victim of a heart attack.
In the 1960s, it occurred to Lansky and other members of the mob that there might be an opportunity to develop a new center of gambling and offshore financial movements.
Nassau, the British colony's capital, was in the hands of a new kind of pirate, the Bay Street Boys. Their leader, Sir Stafford Lofthouse Sands, was also Minister of Finance and the so-called father of Bahamas tourism.
The rulers of the Bahamas at the time were a clique of established white interests known as the Bay Street Boys, in which Stafford Sands featured very prominently. One of the islands that was particularly undeveloped was a scrubby, low-lying island in the north called Grand Bahama. And this became the object of a new project led by Lansky in cooperation with Stafford Sands and others in the Bay Street Boys to literally develop a new casino complex. At the time, gambling was not allowed in the Bahamas, but by the time the hotel was built, the mob had worked with the Bay Street Boys to get the law changed. They'd literally corrupted them through side payments, retainers, legal retainers, and other forms of bribery.
A casino was opened in the Lucayan Beach Hotel, a massive complex officially run by Stafford Sands and unofficially owned by others, among whom was Meyer Lansky.
A key development around this time was the emergence of the eurodollar market. So this opened up important new opportunities for the mob to move money from the United States through the Bahamas into Europe, which was key in thinking about a transatlantic pipeline for drugs and other activities.
And Lansky had a specific need to launder money that was coming out of the casinos and transfer it offshore. And so these banking institutions that were set up in the Bahamas were all ideal for that. This is a precursor to the real takeoff of haven banking in the Bahamas. The early days here are dominated by doing money laundering for organized crime and doing casinos and the kind of activities that, that organized crime is familiar with.
In 1965, after the arrest of a mobster in Florida, the American police got wind of the Bahamas connection and tried to obtain information on cash flow in and out of the islands. The answer from the Bahamas was immediate. Stafford Sands and the Bay Street Boys had laws enacted on banking secrecy. London, in its role as protector, just let them do it. A promotional film from the time presents the fiscal good life Bahamian style.
Until at least 1990, there's a contractual guarantee that no personal or corporate income tax, capital gains tax...
No taxes on income, capital gains, real estate, or personal property. And until the year 2054, no excise levies or import duties for companies registered in Freeport.
One fascinating thing about the Bahamas is that the mob seems to have learned its lesson from Cuba. They recognized that they might not always enjoy the support of the Bay Street Boys, especially as the process of decolonization and the push for greater racial equality led to increasing electoral power for the black opposition.
Panam, that's the way to go. 500 miles an hour or even more. First the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria took a devil of a time to reach down here in the Caribbean.
In 1967, born and bred Bahamian Lyndon Pindling was elected prime minister. As chance would have it, he was just as corrupt as his predecessor.
We want to take a closer look at the casino operation in general. At the very outset, we did not like the fixed fee that the casinos paid. We would like to look at it now from the inside and see whether it would not be more advantageous to the country to negotiate a percentage.
That model is now at the heart of how tax evasion and global finance works around the world. It doesn't necessarily today involve criminal actors in every instance, but the mob was there at the beginning, helping bring it into the world through this experience in the Bahamas.
Meyer Lansky's gamble had paid off. He had established a system that would outlive him. In the following decade, the Colombian cartels went into business with Pindling, and the Bahamas would become a hub for cocaine smuggling into Florida and the United States, backed by a system of casinos, banks, and total immunity. To commemorate these days of glory, the $10 banknote is adorned with the face of Stafford Sands, the $1 note, that of Lyndon Pindling. As we entered the 1970s, new U.S. President
Good evening.
Richard Nixon brought an end to the convertibility of the dollar into gold, all but abolishing the Bretton Woods Agreement. The values of currencies were now left to free market conditions. The controls that regulated the circulation of international capital were abandoned. A new period in financial liberalism had dawned. It was against that backdrop that Michele Sindona was preparing his masterstroke, the purchase of an American bank. He had set his sights on Franklin National Bank, the country's 20th largest bank. With branches in the Bahamas and other tax havens, Franklin gave Sindona the ability to shift all the money he managed in Italy for Cosa Nostra and the Vatican. But Sindona didn't abandon the Italian political arena. The strategy of tension implemented by neo-fascist movements plunged the country into chaos and bloody street battles with the far left. Terrorist attacks and assassinations of public figures weakened the already drifting Italian state.
First, there was terrorism, both far left and far right. Italy became a country of death.
A supporter of the most right-leaning branch of Christian democracy, Michele Sindona was an open backer of Giulio Andreotti, Italy's most powerful politician and the most suspected of mafia connections.
Andreotti was the most powerful politician in Italy, and he had links to Cosa Nostra. There was a time when journalists referred to Andreotti as he whose name starts with the first letter of the alphabet.
During the years of lead, Sindona was convinced that Italy could and should shift to the right, the extreme right. He joined a fascist-inspired Masonic lodge with connections in the highest spheres of Italian politics and the Vatican, Propaganda Due, or P2. With Sindona's political and financial backing, P2 increased coup d'etat attempts and dreamt of installing strong rule and ridding Italy of its communists.
Sindona
interpreted Machiavelli in the worst possible way. He used the end justifies the means in the most detestable way. To get what I want, I will use the foulest methods possible.
Convinced of his genius and of his ability to win the war against communism, at the very top in international finance and close to the divine light, Sindona suddenly fell. In 1974, due to highly risky stock market investments of his own making, Franklin National Bank was declared insolvent. Sindona's Italian banks collapsed in its wake. In 1979, Sindona was arrested in the United States for his role in the Franklin bankruptcy. He was charged with 68 counts of fraud. His financial collapse was a disaster for the Vatican and the Mafia. Everybody dropped him. In Italy, Giorgio Ambrosoli, the lawyer appointed as liquidator of Sindona's empire, discovered the system's black box, hidden financial networks backed by multiple offshore companies, a holding company in Liechtenstein, trading companies. Everything was revealed. From his American prison cell, Sindona attempted to stop the investigations. Ambrosoli received anonymous threats, which he managed to record. In July 1979, Giorgio Ambrosoli was gunned down.
When Andreotti was asked how he felt about Ambrosoli, he answered, he went looking for it. In other words, it's his fault he was killed. That says everything about the relations between Ambrosoli, power, and Sindona.
In 1984, Sindona was extradited from the United States to Italy. In 1986, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for ordering the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli. 2 days after his sentencing, in his prison cell, Sindona drank a coffee poisoned with cyanide and died 2 days later. In the early 1980s, another great figure of the American Mafia passed. Meyer Lansky's ventures in the Bahamas proved to be his last. Deported out of Israel, which had refused his law of return, he finished his life in Florida, cut off from the world and penniless. One of the last photos of him dates from 1975, walking his dog in Miami. The kid from the Lower East Side left with one last quip.
I learned too late that it was a lot easier and more profitable to steal money from people legally than illegally.
The Meyer Lansky and Michele Sindona saga prefigured the decade to come. In the 1980s, financial deregulation, the unprecedented volumes of illegal money that needed to be laundered, and the ease with which these funds would circulate designed the new business model of organized crime. At the heart of this system, the tax havens. The age of the pioneers reached its end in Miami, And it was in Miami that the age of bankers was about to begin.